Dark Benediction. Always fearful of being set upon during the night, Paul slept uneasily despite his weariness from the long trek southward. When dawn broke, he rolled out of his blankets and found himself still stiff with fatigue. He kicked dirt over the remains of the campfire and breakfasted on a tough forequarter of cold-boiled rabbit, which he washed down with a swallow of earthy-tasting ditch water. Then he buckled the cartridge belt about his waist, leaped the ditch, and climbed the embankment to the trafficless four-lane highway whose pavement was scattered with blown leaves and unsightly debris dropped by a long-departed throng of refugees whose only wish had been to escape from one another. Paul, with characteristic independence, had decided to go where the crowds had been the thickest, to the cities, on the theory that they would now be deserted and therefore non-contagious. The fog lay heavy over the silent land, and for a moment he paused, groping for cognizance of direction. Then he saw the stalled car on the opposite shoulder of the road, a late-model convertible, but rusted, flat-tired, with last year's license plates and most certainly out of fuel. It obviously had been deserted by its owner during the exodus, and he trusted in its northward heading as he would have trusted the reading of a compass. He turned right and moved south on the empty highway. Somewhere just ahead in the gray vapor lay the outskirts of Houston. He had seen the high skyline before the setting of yesterday's sun and knew that his journey would soon be drawing to a close. Occasionally, he passed a deserted cottage or a burned-out roadside tavern, but he did not pause to scrounge for food. The exodus would have stripped such buildings clean. Pickings should be better in the heart of the metropolitan area, he thought, where the hysteria had swept humanity away quickly. Suddenly, Paul froze on the highway, listening to the fog. Footsteps in the distance, footsteps and a voice singing an absent-minded ditty to itself. No other sounds penetrated the sepulchral silence which once had growled with the life of a great city. Anxiety caught him with clammy hands. An old man's voice it was, crackling and tuneless. Paul groped for his holster and brought out the revolver he had taken from a deserted police station. "Stop where you are, Dermy," he bellowed at the fog. "I'm armed." The footsteps and the singing stopped. Paul strained his eyes to penetrate the swirling mist shroud. After a moment, the oldster answered. "Sure foggy, ain't it, sonny? Can't see ya. Better come a little closer. I ain't no Dermy." Loathing choked in Paul's throat. "The hell you're not. Nobody else would be crazy enough to sing. Get off the road. I'm going south, and if I see you, I'll shoot. Now move." "Sure, sonny. I'll move. But I'm no Dermy. I was just singing to keep myself company. I'm past caring about the plague. I'm heading north, where there's people, and if some Dermy hears me a-singing, why, I'll tell him to come join in. What's the good of being healthy if you're alone?" While the old man spoke, Paul heard his sloshing across the ditch and climbing through the brush. Doubt assailed him. Maybe the old crank wasn't a Dermy. An ordinary plague victim would have whimpered and pleaded for satisfaction of his strange craving, the laying on of hands, the feel of healthy skin beneath moist gray palms. Nevertheless, Paul meant to take no chances with the oldster. "Stay back in the brush while I walk past," he called. "Okay, sonny. You go right by. I ain't gonna touch you. You aimin' to scrounge in Houston?" Paul began to advance. Yeah, I figure people got out so fast, they must have left plenty of canned goods and stuff behind. There's a mite here and there, said the cracked voice in a tone that implied understatement. Course, now, you ain't the first to figure that way, you know? Paul slacked his pace, frowning. You mean, a lot of people are coming back? No, not a lot, but you'll bump into people every day or two. Ain't my kind of folks. Rough characters, mostly. Don't take chances, either. They'll shoot first, then look to see if you was a dermy. Don't ever come bustling out of a doorway without taking a peek at the street first. And if two people come around a corner in opposite directions, somebody's gonna die. The few that's there is trigger happy. Just thought I'd warn you. Thanks. To mention it. Been good to hear a body's voice again, though I can't see ye. Paul moved on until he was 50 paces past the voice. Then he stopped and turned. Okay, you can get back on the road now. Start walking north. Scuff your feet until you're out of earshot. Taking no chances, are ye? Said the old man as he waded the ditch. All right, sonny. The sound of his footsteps hesitated on the pavement. A word of advice. Your best scrounging'll be around the warehouses. Most of the stores are picked clean. Good luck. Paul stood listening to the shuffling feet recede northward. When they became inaudible, he turned to continue his journey. The meeting had depressed him, reminded him of the animal level to which he and others like him had sunk. The oldster was obviously healthy, but Paul had been chased by 3 dermies in as many days, and the thought of being trapped by a band of them in the fog left him unnerved. Once he had seen a pair of the grinning, maddened compulsives seize a screaming young child while each of them took turns caressing the youngster's arms and face with the gray and slippery hands that spelled certain contraction of the disease, if disease it was. The dark pall of neuroderm was unlike any illness that Earth had ever seen. The victim became the eager ally of the sickness that gripped him. Caught in its demoniac madness, the stricken human searched hungrily for healthy comrades, then set upon them with no other purpose than to paw at the clean skin and praise the virtues of the blind compulsion that drove him to do so. One touch, and infection was ensured. It was as if a third of humanity had become night-prowling maniacs, lurking in the shadows to seize the unwary, working in bands to trap the unarmed wanderer, and 2/3 of humanity found itself fleeing in horror from the mania, seeking the frigid northern climates where, according to rumor, the disease was less infectious. The normal functioning of civilization had been dropped like a hot potato within 6 months after the first alarm. When the man at the next lathe might be hiding gray discolorations beneath his shirt, industrial society was no place for humanity. Rumor connected the onslaught of the plague with an unpredicted swarm of meteorites which had brightened the sky one October evening 2 weeks before the first case was discovered. The first case was, in fact, a machinist who had found one of the celestial cannonballs, handled it, weighed it, estimated its volume by fluid displacement, then cut into it on his lathe because its low density suggested that it might be hollow. He claimed to have found a pocket of frozen jelly, still rigid from deep space, although the outer shell had been heated white-hot by atmospheric friction. He said he let the jelly thaw, then fed it to his cat because it had an unpleasant fishy odor. Shortly thereafter, the cat disappeared. Other meteorites had been discovered and similarly treated by university staffs before there was any reason to blame them for the plague. Paul, who had been an engineering student at Texas U at the time of the incident, had heard it said that the missiles were purposefully manufactured by parties unknown, that the jelly contained micro-organisms which, under the microscope, suggested a cross between a sperm cell, because of a similar tail, and a Puccini corpuscle, because of a marked resemblance to nerve tissue in subcellular detail. When the meteorites were connected with the new and mushrooming disease, some people started a panic by theorizing that the meteor swarm was a pre-invasion artillery attack by some space horde lurking beyond telescope range and waiting for their biological bombardment to wreck civilization before they moved in upon Earth. The government had immediately labeled all investigations top secret, and Paul had heard no news since the initial speculations. Indeed, the government might have explained the whole thing and proclaimed it to the country for all he knew. One thing was certain: the country had not heard. It no longer possessed channels of communication. Paul thought that if any such invaders were coming, they would have already arrived months ago. Civilization was not truly wrecked. It had simply been discarded during the crazed flight of the individual away from the herd. Industry lay idle and unmanned, but still intact. Man was fleeing from man. Fear had destroyed the integration of his society and had left him powerless before any hypothetical invaders. Earth was ripe for plucking, but it remained unplucked and withering. Paul, therefore, discarded the invasion hypothesis and searched for nothing new to replace it. He accepted the fact of his own existence in the midst of chaos and sought to protect that existence as best he could. It proved to be a full-time job, with no spare time for theorizing. Life was a rabbit scurrying over a hill. Life was a warm blanket and a secluded sleeping place. Life was ditch water and an unbloated can of corned beef and a suit of clothing looted from a deserted cottage. Life, above all else, was an avoidance of other human beings, for no dermy had the grace to cry unclean to the unsuspecting. If the dermy's discolorations were still in the concealable stage, then concealed they would be, while the lost creature deliberately sought to infect his wife, his children, his friends, whoever would not protest an idle touch of the hand. When the grayness touched the face and the backs of the hands, the creature became a feverish night wanderer, subject to strange hallucinations and delusions and desires. The fog began to part toward mid-morning as Paul drove deeper into the outskirts of Houston. The highway was becoming a commercial sub-center, lined with businesses and small shops. The sidewalks were showered with broken glass from windows kicked in by looters. Paul kept to the center of the deserted street, listening and watching cautiously for signs of life. The distant barking of a dog was the only sound in the once growling metropolis. A flight of sparrows winged down the street, then darted in through a broken window to an inside nesting place. He searched a small grocery store, looking for a snack, but the shelves were bare. The thoroughfare had served as a main avenue of escape, and the fugitives had looted it thoroughly to obtain provisions. He turned onto a side street, then, after several blocks, turned again to parallel the highway, moving through an old residential section. Many houses had been left open, but few had been looted. He entered one old frame mansion and found a can of tomatoes in the kitchen. He opened it and sipped the tender delicacy from the container while curiosity sent him prowling through the rooms. He wandered up the first flight of stairs, then halted with one foot on the landing. A body lay sprawled across the second flight. The body of a young man, dead quite a while. A well-rusted pistol had fallen from his hand. Paul dropped the tomatoes and bolted for the street. Suicide was a common recourse when a man learned that he had been touched. After 2 blocks, Paul stopped running. He sat panting on a fire hydrant and chided himself for being overly cautious. The man had been dead for months, and infection was achieved only through contact. Nevertheless, his scalp was still tingling. When he had rested briefly, he continued his plodding course toward the heart of the city. Toward noon, he saw another human being. The man was standing on the loading dock of a warehouse, apparently enjoying the sunlight that came with the dissolving of the fog. He was slowly and solemnly spooning the contents of a can into a red-lipped mouth while his beard bobbled with appreciative chewing. Suddenly, he saw Paul, who had stopped in the center of the street with his hand on the butt of his pistol. The man backed away, tossed the can aside, and sprinted the length of the platform. He bounded off the end, snatched a bicycle away from the wall, and pedaled quickly out of sight while he bleated shrill blasts on a police whistle clenched between his teeth. Paul trotted to the corner, but the man had made another turn. His whistle continued bleeding. A signal? A dermy summons to a touching orgy? Paul stood still while he tried to overcome an urge to break into panicked flight. After a minute, the clamor ceased, but the silence was ominous. If a party of cyclists moved in, he could not escape on foot. He darted toward the nearest warehouse, seeking a place to hide. Inside, he climbed a stack of boxes to a horizontal girder and kicked the stack to topple it and stretched out, belly down, on the steel I-beam to command a clear shot at the entrances. He lay for an hour, waiting quietly for searchers. None came. At last, he slid down a vertical support and returned to the loading platform. The street was empty and silent. With weapon ready, he continued his journey. He passed the next intersection without mishap. Halfway up the block, a calm voice drawled a command from behind him. "Drop the gun, Dermy. Get your hands behind your head." He halted, motionless. No plague victim would hurl the Dermy charge at another. He dropped the pistol and turned slowly. 3 men with drawn revolvers were clamoring from the back of a stalled truck. They were all bearded, wore blue jeans, blue neckerchiefs, and green woolen shirts. He suddenly recalled that the man on the loading platform had been similarly dressed. A uniform? "Turn around again," barked the speaker. Paul turned, realizing that the men were probably some sort of self-appointed quarantine patrol. Tow ropes suddenly skidded out from behind and came to a stop near his feet on the pavement. A pair of lariat loops. "1 foot in each loop, Dermy," the speaker snapped. When Paul obeyed, the ropes were jerked taut about his ankles, and 2 of the men trotted out to the sides, stood 30 feet apart, and pulled his legs out into a wide straddle. He quickly saw that any movement would cost him his balance. "Stripped to the skin." "I'm no dermy," Paul protested as he unbuttoned his shirt. "We'll see for ourselves, Joe," grunted the leader as he moved around to the front. "Get the top off first. If your chest's okay, we'll let your feet go." When Paul had undressed, the leader walked around him slowly, making him spread his fingers and display the soles of his feet. He stood shivering and angry in the chilly winter air, while the men satisfied themselves that he wore no gray patches of neuroderm. "You're all right, I guess," the speaker admitted. Then, as Paul stooped to recover his clothing, the man growled, "Not those. Jim, get him a Proby outfit." Paul caught a bundle of clean clothing tossed to him from the back of the truck. There were jeans, a woolen shirt, and a kerchief, but the shirt and kerchief were red. He shot an inquiring glance at the leader while he climbed into the welcome change. "All newcomers are on 2 weeks probation," the man explained. "If you decide to stay in Houston, you'll get another exam next time the uniform code changes. Then you can join our outfit if you don't show up with the plague. In fact, you'll have to join if you stay." "What is the outfit?" Paul asked suspiciously. "It just started. School teacher name of George L. organized it. We aim to keep dermies out. There's about 600 of us now. We guard the downtown area, but as soon as there's enough of us, we'll move out to take in more territory, set up roadblocks and all that. You're welcome as soon as we're sure you're clean and can take orders." "Whose orders?" "George L's. We got no room for goof-offs and no time for argument. Anybody don't like the setup, he's welcome to get out. Jim here'll give you a leaflet on the rules. Better read it before you go anywhere. If you don't, you might make a wrong move. Make a wrong move, and you catch a bullet." The man called Jim interrupted. "Reckon you better call off the other patrols, Digger," he said respectfully to the leader. Digger nodded curtly and turned to blow 3 short blasts and a long with his whistle. An answering short, long, short came from several blocks away. Other posts followed suit. Paul realized that he had been surrounded by a ring of similar ambushes. "Jim, take him to the nearest water barrel and see that he shaves," Digger ordered. Then, "What's your name, Proby? Also your job, if you had one." "Paul Harris Oberlin. I was a mechanical engineering student when the plague struck, part-time garage mechanic while I was in school." Digger nodded and jotted down the information on a scratch pad. "Good. I'll turn your name into the registrar. George L. says to watch for college men. You might get a good assignment later. Report to the Esperson building on the 17th. That's inspection day. If you don't show up, we'll come looking for you. All loose probies will get shot. Now Jim here's going to see to it that you shave. Don't shave again until you're 2 weeker. That way we can estimate how long you've been in town by looking at your beard. We got other ways that you don't need to know about. George L's got a system worked out for everything, so don't try any tricks." "Tell me, what do you do with dermies?" Digger grinned at his men. "You'll find out, Proby." Paul was led to a rain barrel, given a basin, a razor, and soap. He scraped his face clean while Jim sat at a safe distance, munching a quid of tobacco and watching the operation with tired boredom. The other men had gone. "May I have my pistol back?" Read the rules. No weapons for probies." "Suppose I bump into a dermy?" "Find yourself a whistle and toot a bunch of short blasts, then run like hell. We'll take care of the dermies. Read the rules." "Can I scrounge wherever I want to?" "Probies have their own assigned areas. There's a map in the rules." "Who wrote the rules, anyhow?" "Jesus!" The guard grunted disgustedly. Read 'em and find out." When Paul finished shaving, Jim stood up, stretched, then bounded off the platform and picked up his bicycle. "Where do I go from here?" Paul called. The man gave him a contemptuous snort, mounted the bike, and pedaled leisurely away. Paul gathered that he was to read the rules. He sat down beside the rain barrel and began studying the mimeographed leaflet. Everything was cut and dried. As a probie, he was confined to an area 6 blocks square near the heart of the city. Once he entered it, a blue mark would be stamped on his forehead. At the 2-week inspection, the indelible brand would be removed with a special solution. If a branded probie were caught outside his area, he would be forcibly escorted from the city. He was warned against attempting to impersonate permanent personnel because a system of codes and passwords would ensnare him. One full page of the leaflet was devoted to propaganda. Houston was to become a bulwark of health in a stricken world and the leader of a glorious recovery. The paper was signed by Dr. Georgel, who had given himself the title of director. The pamphlet left Paul with a vague uneasiness. The uniforms, they reminded him of neighborhood boys' gangs in the slums, wearing special sweaters and uttering secret passwords, whipping intruders and amputating the tails of stray cats in darkened garages. And, in another way, it made him think of frustrated little people gathering at night in brown shirts around a bonfire to sing the Hearst Vessel Lied and listen to grandiose oratory about glorious destinies. Their stray cats had been an unfavored race. Of course, the dermies were not merely harmless alley prowlers. They were a real menace, and maybe Georgel's methods were the only ones effective. While Paul sat with the pamphlet on the platform, he had been gazing absently at the stalled truck from which the men had emerged. Suddenly, it broke upon his consciousness that it was a diesel. He bounded off the platform and went to check its fuel tank, which had been left uncapped. He knew that it was useless to search for gasoline, but diesel fuel was another matter. The exodus had drained all existing supplies of high-octane fuel for the escaping motorcade, but the evacuation had been too hasty and too fear-crazed to worry with out-of-the-ordinary methods. He sniffed the tank. It smelled faintly of gasoline. Some unknowing fugitive had evidently filled it with ordinary fuel, which had later evaporated. But if the cylinders had not yet been damaged by the trial, the truck might be useful. He checked the engine briefly and decided that it had not been tried at all. The starting battery had been removed. He walked across the street and looked back at the warehouse. It bore the sign of a trucking firm. He walked around the block, eyeing the streets cautiously for other patrolmen. There was a fueling platform on the opposite side of the block. A fresh splash of oil on the concrete told him that Georgel's crew was using the fuel for some purpose, possibly for heating or cooking. He entered the building and found a repair shop with several dismantled engines lying about. There was a rack of batteries in the corner, but a screwdriver placed across the terminals brought only a weak spark. The chargers, of course, drew power from the city's electric service, which was dead. After giving the problem some thought, Paul connected 5 of the batteries in series and placed a 6th across the total voltage so that it would collect the charge that the others lost. Then he went to carry buckets of fuel from the pumps to the truck. When the tank was filled, he hoisted each end of the truck with a roll-under jack and inflated the tires with a hand pump. It was a long and laborious job. Twilight was gathering by the time he was ready to try it. Several times during the afternoon he had been forced to hide from cyclists who wandered past, lest they send him onto the Proby area and use the truck for their own purposes. Evidently, they had long since decided that automotive transportation was a thing of the past. A series of short whistle blasts came to his ears just as he was climbing into the cab. The signals were several blocks away, but some of the answering bleats were closer. Evidently, another newcomer, he thought. Most new arrivals from the north would pass through the same area on their way downtown. He entered the cab, closed the door softly, and ducked low behind the dashboard as 3 cyclists raced across the intersection just ahead. Paul settled down to wait for the all-clear. It came after about 10 minutes. Apparently, the newcomer had tried to run instead of hiding. When the cyclists returned, they were moving leisurely and laughing among themselves. After they had passed the intersection, Paul stole quietly out of the cab and moved along the wall to the corner to assure himself that all the patrolmen had gone. But the sound of the shrill pleading came to his ears. At the end of the building, he clung close to the wall and risked a glance around the corner. A block away, the nude figure of a girl was struggling between taut ropes held by green-shirted guards. She was a pretty girl, with a tousled mop of chestnut hair and clean white limbs. Clean, except for her forearms, which appeared dipped in dark stain. Then he saw the dark, irregular splotch across her flank, like a splash of ink not quite washed clean. She was a dermy. Paul ducked close to the ground so that his face was hidden by a clump of grass at the corner. A man, the leader of the group, had left the girl and was advancing up the street toward Paul, who prepared to roll under the building out of sight. But in the middle of the block, the man stopped. He lifted a manhole cover in the pavement, then went back for the girl's clothing, which he dragged at the end of a fishing pole with a wire hook at its tip. He dropped the clothing, one piece at a time, into the manhole. A cloud of white dust arose from it, and the man stepped back to avoid the dust. Quicklime, Paul guessed. Then the leader cupped his hand to his mouth and called back to the others, "Okay, drag her on up here." He drew his revolver and waited while they tugged the struggling girl toward the manhole. Paul felt suddenly ill. He had seen dermies shot in self-defense by fugitives from their deathly gray hands, but here was cold and efficient elimination. Here was Dachau and Buchenwald and the nameless camps of Siberia. He turned and bolted for the truck. The sound of its engine starting brought a halt to the disposal of the pest girl. The leader appeared at the intersection and stared uncertainly at the truck as Paul nosed it away from the building. He fidgeted with his revolver doubtfully and called something over his shoulder to the others. Then he began walking out into the street and signaling for the truck to stop. Paul let it crawl slowly ahead and leaned out the window to eye the man questioningly. "How the hell you get that started?" the leader called excitedly. He was still holding the pistol, but it dangled almost unnoticed in his hand. Paul suddenly fed fuel to the diesel and swerved sharply toward the surprised guardsman. The leader yelped and dived for safety, but the fender caught his hips, spun him off balance, and smashed him down against the pavement. As the truck thundered around the corner toward the girl and her captors, he glanced in the mirror to see the hurt man weakly trying to crawl out of the street. Paul was certain that he was not mortally wounded. As the truck lumbered on, the girl threw herself prone before it, since the ropes prevented any escape. Paul swerved erratically, sending the girl's captors scurrying for the alley. Then he aimed the wheels to straddle her body. She glanced up, screamed, then hugged the pavement as the behemoth thundered overhead. A bullet plowed a furrow across the hood. Paul ducked low in the seat and jammed the brake pedal down as soon as he thought she was clear. There were several shots, but apparently they were shooting at the girl. Paul counted 3 seconds, then gunned the engine again. If she hadn't climbed aboard, it was just tough luck, he thought grimly. He shouldn't have tried to save her anyway. But continued shooting told him that she had managed to get inside. The trailer was heaped with clothing, and he trusted the mound of material to halt the barrage of bullets. He heard the explosion of a blowout as he swung around the next corner, and the trailer lurched dangerously. It swayed from side to side as he gathered speed down the wide and trafficless avenue, but the truck had double wheels, and soon the dangerous lurching ceased. He roared on through the metropolitan area, staying on the same street and gathering speed. An occasional scrounger or cyclist stopped to stare, but they seemed too surprised to act, and they could not have known what had transpired a few blocks away. Paul could not stop to see if he had a passenger or if she was still alive. She was more dangerous than the gunman. Any gratitude she might feel toward her rescuer would be quickly buried beneath her craving to spread the disease. He wished fervently that he had let the patrolman kill her. Now he was faced with the problem of getting rid of her. He noticed, however, that mirrors were mounted on both sides of the cab. If he stopped the truck, and if she climbed out, he could see and move away again before she had the chance to approach him. But he decided to wait until they were out of the city. Soon he saw a highway marker, then a sign that said Galveston, 58 miles. He bore ahead, thinking that perhaps the island city would provide good scrounging without the regimentation of Dr. Georgel's efficient system with its plans for glorious recovery. 20 miles beyond the city limits, he stopped the truck, let the engine idle, and waited for his passenger to climb out. He locked the doors and laid a jack handle across the seat as an added precaution. Nothing happened. He rolled down the window and shouted toward the rear. "All passengers off the bus. Last stop. Everybody out." Still, the girl did not appear. Then he heard something, a slight tap from the trailer, and a murmur, or a moan. She was there, all right. He called again, but she made no response. It was nearly dark outside. At last he seized the jack-handle, opened the door, and stepped out of the cab. Wary of a trick, he skirted wide around the trailer and approached it from the rear. One door was closed, while the other swung free. He stopped a few yards away and peered inside. At first, he saw nothing. "Get out, but keep away, or I'll kill you." Then he saw her move. She was sitting on the floor, leaning back against a heap of clothing a dozen feet from the entrance. He stepped forward cautiously and flung open the other door. She turned her head to look at him peculiarly, but said nothing. He could see that she had donned some of the clothing, but one trouser leg was rolled up, and she had tied a rag tightly about her ankle. "Are you hurt?" She nodded. "Bullet?" She rolled her head dizzily and moaned. Paul went back to the cab to search for a first aid kit. He found one, together with a flashlight and spare batteries in the glove compartment. He made certain that the cells were not corroded and that the light would burn feebly. Then he returned to the trailer, chiding himself for a prized fool. A sensible human would haul the dermy out at the end of a towing chain and leave her sitting by the side of the road. "If you try to touch me, I'll brain you," he warned as he clambered into the trailer. She looked up again. "Would you feel like enjoying anything if you were bleeding like this?" she muttered weakly. The flashlight beam caught the glitter of pain in her eyes and accentuated the pallor of her small face. She was a pretty girl, scarcely older than 20, but Paul was in no mood to appreciate pretty women, especially dermies. "So that's how you think of it, eh? Enjoying yourself?" She said nothing. She dropped her forehead against her knee and rolled it slowly. "Where are you hit? Just the foot?" "Ankle." "All right. Take the rag off. Let's see." "The wound is in back." "All right. Lie down on your stomach and keep your hands under your head." She stretched out weakly, and he shone the light over her leg to make certain its skin was clear of neuroderm. Then he looked at the ankle and said nothing for a time. The bullet had missed the joint but had neatly severed the Achilles tendon just above the heel. "You're a plucky kid," he grunted, wondering how she endured the self-torture of getting the shoe off and clothing herself. "It was cold back here, without clothes," she muttered. Paul opened the first aid packet and found an envelope of sulfa powder. Without touching her, he emptied it into the wound, which was beginning to bleed again. There was nothing else he could do. The tendon had pulled apart and would require surgical stitching to bring it together until it could heal. Such attention was out of the question. She broke the silence. I'm going to be crippled, aren't I?" "Oh, not crippled," he heard himself telling her. "If we can get you to a doctor, anyway. Tendons can be sutured with wire. He'll probably put your foot in a cast, and you might get a stiff ankle from it." She lay, breathing quietly, denying his hopeful words by her silence. "Here," he said. "Here's a gauze pad and some tape. Can you manage it yourself?" She started to sit up. He placed the first aid pack beside her and backed to the door. She fumbled in the kit and whimpered while she taped the pad in place. "There's a tourniquet in there, too. Use it if the bleeding's worse." She looked up to watch his silhouette against the darkening sky. "Thanks. Thanks a lot, mister. I'm grateful. I promise not to touch you. Not if you don't want me to." Shivering, he moved back to the cab. Why did they always get that insane idea that they were doing their victims a favor by giving them the neural plague? Not if you don't want me to? He shuddered as he drove away. She felt that way now, while the pain robbed her of the craving, but later, unless he got rid of her quickly, she would come to feel that she owed it to him as a favor. The disease perpetuated itself by arousing such strange delusions in its bearer. The micro-organism's methods of survival were indeed highly specialized. Paul felt certain that such animalcules had not evolved on Earth. A light gleamed here and there along the Alvin-Galveston highway, oil lamps shining from lonely cottages whose occupants had not felt the pressing urgency of the crowded city. But he had no doubt that to approach one of the farmhouses would bring a rifle bullet as a welcome. Where could he find help for the girl? No one would touch her but another dermy. Perhaps he could unhitch the trailer and leave her in downtown Galveston with a sign hung on back, "Wounded Dermy" inside. The plague victims would care for their own if they found her. He chided himself again for worrying about her. Saving her life didn't make him responsible for her, did it? After all, if she lived and the leg healed, she would only prowl in search of healthy victims again. She would never be rid of the disease, nor would she ever die of it, so far as anyone knew. The death rate was high among dermies, but the cause was usually a bullet. Paul passed a fork in the highway and knew that the bridge was just ahead. Beyond the channel lay Galveston Island, once brightly lit and laughing in its role as seaside resort, now immersed in darkness. The wind whipped at the truck from the southwest as the road led up onto the wide causeway. A faint glow in the east spoke of a moon about to rise. He saw the wide structure of the drawbridge just ahead. Suddenly he clutched at the wheel, smashed furiously down on the brake, and tugged the emergency back. The tires howled ahead on the smooth concrete, and the force threw him forward over the wheel. Dusty water swirled far below where the upward folding gates of the drawbridge had once been. He skidded to a stop 10 feet from the end. When he climbed out, the girl was calling weakly from the trailer, but he walked to the edge and looked over. Someone had done a job with dynamite. Why, he wondered. To keep islanders on the island or to keep mainlanders off? Had another Dr. Georgel started his own small nation in Galveston? It seemed more likely that the lower island dwellers had done the demolition. He looked back at the truck. An experienced truckster might be able to swing it around all right, but Paul was doubtful. Nevertheless, he climbed back in the cab and tried it. Half an hour later, he was hopelessly jammed, with the trailer twisted aside and the cab wedged near the sheer drop to the water. He gave up and went back to inspect his infected cargo. She was asleep, but moaning faintly. He prodded her awake with the jack-handle. "Can you crawl, kid? If you can, come back to the door." She nodded and began dragging herself toward the flashlight. She clenched her lip between her teeth to keep from whimpering, but her breath came as a voiced murr. She sagged weakly when she reached the entrance, and for a moment he thought she had fainted. Then she looked up. "What's next, Skipper?" she panted. I don't know. Can you let yourself down to the pavement?" She glanced over the edge and shook her head. "With a rope, maybe? There's one back there someplace. If you're scared of me, I'll try to crawl and get it." "Hands to yourself?" he asked suspiciously. Then he thanked the darkness for hiding the heat of shame that crawled to his face. "I won't." He scrambled into the trailer quickly and brought back the rope. "I'll climb up on top and let it down in front of you. Grab hold and let yourself down." A few minutes later, she was sitting on the concrete causeway, looking at the wrecked draw. "Oh," she muttered as she scrambled down from atop the trailer. "I thought you just wanted to dump me here. We're stuck, huh?" "Yeah. We might swim it, but doubt if you could make it." "I'd try." She paused, cocking her head slightly. "There's a boat moored under the bridge right over there." "What makes you think so?" "Water lapping against wood. Listen." Then she shook her head. "I forgot. You're not hyper." "I'm not what?" Paul listened. The water sounds seemed homogeneous. "Hyper-acute. Sharp senses. You know, it's one of the symptoms." He nodded, remembering vaguely that he'd heard something to that effect, but he'd chalked it up as hallucinatory phenomenon. He walked to the rail and shone his light toward the water. The boat was there, tugging its rope taut from the mooring as the tide swirled about it. The bottom was still fairly dry, indicating that a recent rower had crossed from the island to the mainland. "Think you can hold on to the rope if I let you down?" he called. She gave him a quick glance, then picked up the end she had previously touched and tied a loop about her waist. She began crawling toward the rail. Paul fought down a crazy urge to pick her up and carry her, plague be damned. But he had already left himself dangerously open to contagion. Still, he felt the drumming charges of conscience. "Depart from me, ye accursed, for I was sick, and you visited me not." He turned quickly away and began knotting the end of the rope about the rail. He reminded himself that any sane person would desert her at once and swim on to safety. Yet he could not. In the oversized clothing, she looked like a child, hurt and helpless. Paul knew the demanding arrogance that could possess the wounded. "Help me, you've got to help me, you damn merciless bastard. No, don't touch me there, damn you." Too many times he had heard the sick curse the physician and the injured curse the rescuer. Blind aggression trying to strike back at pain. But the girl made no complaint except the involuntary hurt sounds. She asked nothing and accepted his aid with a wide-eyed gratitude that left him weak. He thought that it would be easier to leave her if she would only beg or plead or demand. "Can you start me swinging a little?" she called as he lowered her toward the water. Paul's eyes probed the darkness below, trying to sort the shadows to make certain which was the boat. He used both hands to feed out the rope, and the light laid on the rail only seemed to blind him. She began swinging herself pendulum-wise somewhere beneath him. "When I say ready, let me go," she shrilled. "You're not going to drop." "Have to. Boat's out farther. Got to swing for it. I can't swim, really." "But you'll hurt your—" "Ready!" Paul still clung to the rope. "I'll let you down into the water and you can hang on to the rope. I'll dive and then pull you into the boat." You'd have to touch me. You don't want that, do you? Just a second now. One more swing. Ready?" He let the rope go. With a clatter and a thud, she hit the boat. 3 sharp cries of pain clawed at him. Then, muffled sobbing. "Are you all right?" Sobs. She seemed not to hear him. Jesus. He sprinted for the brink of the drawbridge and dived out over the deep channel. How far? Down. Down. Icy water stung his body with sharp whips, then opened to embrace him. He fought to the surface and swam toward the dark shadow of the boat. The sobbing had subsided. He grasped the prow and hauled himself, dripping, from the channel. She was lying curled in the bottom of the boat. "Kid. You all right, kid?" "Sorry. I'm such a baby," she gasped and dragged herself back to the stern. Paul found a paddle, but no oars. He cast off and began digging water toward the other side, but the tide tugged them relentlessly away from the bridge. He gave it up and paddled toward the distant shore. "You know anything about Galveston?" he called, mostly to reassure himself that she was not approaching him in the darkness with the death-gray hands. "I used to come here for the summer. I know a little about it." Paul urged her to talk while he plowed toward the island. Her name was Willie, and she insisted that it was for Willow, not Wilhelmina. She came from Dallas and claimed she was a salesman's daughter who was done in by a traveling farmer. The farmer, she explained, was just a wandering dermy who had caught her napping by the roadside. He had stroked her arms until she awoke, then had run away, howling with glee. "That was 3 weeks ago," she said. "If I'd had a gun, I'd have dropped him. Of course, I know better now." Paul shuddered and paddled on. "Why did you head south?" "I was coming here." "Here?" "To Galveston." "Uh-huh. I heard someone say that a lot of nuns were coming to the island. I thought maybe they'd take me in." The moon was high over the lightless city, and the tide had swept the small boat far east from the bridge by the time Paul's paddle dug into the mud beneath the shallow water. He bounded out and dragged the boat through thin marsh grass onto the shore. 50 yards away, a ramshackle fishing cottage lay sleeping in the moonlight. "Stay here, Willie," he grunted. "I'll find a couple of boards or something for crutches." He rummaged about through a shed behind the cottage and brought back a wheelbarrow. Moaning and laughing at once, she struggled into it, and he wheeled her to the house, humming a verse of Rickshaw Boy. "You're a funny guy, Paul. I'm sorry." She jiggled her tousled head in the moonlight as if she disapproved of her own words. Paul tried the cottage door, kicked it open, then walked the wheelbarrow up 3 steps and into a musty room. He struck a match, found an oil lamp with a little kerosene, and lit it. Willie caught her breath. He looked around. "Company," he grunted. The company sat in a fragile rocker with a shawl about her shoulders and a shotgun between her knees. She had been dead at least a month. The charge of buckshot had sieved the ceiling and spattered it with bits of gray hair and brown blood. "Stay here," he told the girl tonelessly. "I'll try to get a dermy somewhere, one who knows how to sew a tendon. Got any ideas?" She was staring with a sick face at the old woman. "Here? With—" "She won't bother you," he said as he gently disentangled the gun from the corpse. He moved to a cupboard and found a box of shells behind an orange teapot. "I may not be back, but I'll send somebody." She buried her face in her plague-stained hands, and he stood for a moment, watching her shoulders shiver. "Don't worry. I will send somebody." He stepped to the porcelain sink and pocketed a wafer-thin sliver of dry soap. "What's that for?" she muttered, looking up again. He thought of a lie, then checked it. "To wash you off of me," he said truthfully. "I might have got too close. Soap won't do much good, but I'll feel better." He looked at the corpse coolly. "Didn't do her much good. Buckshot's the best antiseptic, all right." Willie moaned as he went out the door. He heard her crying as he walked down to the waterfront. She was still crying when he waded back to shore after a thorough scrubbing. He was sorry he'd spoken cruelly, but it was such a damned relief to get rid of her. With the shotgun cradled on his arm, he began putting distance between himself and the sobbing, but the sound worried his ears even after he realized that he was no longer hearing her. He strode a short distance inland past scattered fishing shanties, then took the highway toward the city whose outskirts he was entering. It would be at least an hour's trek to the end of the island where he would be most likely to encounter someone with medical training. The hospitals were down there, the medical school, the most likely place for any charitable nuns, if Willie's rumor were true. Paul meant to capture a dermy doctor or nurse and force the amorous-handed maniac at gunpoint to go to Willie's aid. Then he would be done with her. When she stopped hurting, she would start craving, and he had no doubt that he would be the object of her manual affections. The bay was wind-chopped in the moonglow, no longer glittering from the lights along 61st Street. The oleanders along Broadway were choked up with weeds. Cats or rabbits rustled in the tousled growth that had been a carefully tended parkway. Paul wondered why the plague had chosen man and not the lower animals. It was true that an occasional dog or cow was seen with the plague, but the focus was upon humanity. And the craving to spread the disease was man-directed, even in animals. It was as if the neural entity deliberately sought out the species with the most complex nervous system. Was its onslaught really connected with the meteorite swarm? Paul believed that it was. In the first place, the meteorites had not been predicted, and they were not a part of the regular cosmic bombardment. And then there was the strange report that they were manufactured projectiles, teeming with frozen micro-organisms which came alive upon thawing. In these days of tumult and confusion, however, it was hard. Nevertheless, Paul believed it. Neuroderm had no first cousins among Earth diseases. What manner of beings, then, had sent such a curse? Potential invaders? If so, they were slow in coming. One thing was generally agreed upon by the scientists. The missiles had not been sent from another solar planet. Their direction upon entering the atmosphere was wrong. They could conceivably have been fired from an interplanetary launching ship, but their velocity was about equal to the theoretical velocity which a body would obtain in falling sunward from the near-infinite distance. This seemed to hint the projectiles had come from another star. Paul was startled suddenly by the flare of a match from the shadow of a building. He stopped dead still in the street. A man was leaning against the wall to light a cigarette. He flicked the match out, and Paul watched the cigarette glow make an arc as the man waved at him. "Nice night, isn't it?" said the voice from the darkness. Paul stood exposed in the moonlight, carrying the shotgun at the ready. The voice sounded like that of an adolescent, not fully changed to its adult timbre. If the youth wasn't a dermy, why wasn't he afraid that Paul might be one? And if he was a dermy, why wasn't he advancing in the hope that Paul might be as yet untouched? "I said, nice night, isn't it? What you carrying the gun for? Been shooting rabbits?" Paul moved a little closer and fumbled for his flashlight. Then he threw its beam on the slouching figure in the shadows. He saw a young man, perhaps 16, reclining against the wall. He saw the pearl-gray face that characterized the final and permanent stage of neuroderm. He stood frozen to the spot a dozen feet away from the youth, who blinked perplexedly into the light. The kid was assuming automatically that he was another dermy. Paul tried to keep him blinded while he played along with the fallacy. "Yeah, it's a nice night. You got any idea where I can find a doctor?" The boy frowned. "Doctor? You mean you don't know?" "Know what? I'm new here." "New? Oh." The boy's nostrils began twitching slightly, as if he were sniffing at the night air. "Well, most of the priests down at St. Mary's were missionaries. They're all doctors." "Why? You sick?" "No, there's a girl, but never mind. How do I get there? And are any of them dermies?" The boy's eyes wandered peculiarly, and his mouth fell open as if he had been asked why a circle wasn't square. "You are new, aren't you? They're all dermies, if you want to call them that. What?" Again, the nostrils were flaring. He flicked the cigarette away suddenly and inhaled a slow draft of the breeze. I smell a non-hyper," he muttered. Paul started to back away. His scalp bristled a warning. The boy advanced a step toward him. A slow beam of anticipation began to glow in his face. He bared his teeth in a wide grin of pleasure. "You're not a hyper yet," he hissed, moving forward. "I've never had a chance to touch a non-hyper." "Stay back or I'll kill you." The lad giggled and came on, talking to himself. "The padre says it's wrong, but you smell so... He flung himself forward with a low, throaty cry. Paul sidestepped the charge and brought the gun barrel down across the boy's head. The dermy sprawled, howling, in the street. Paul pushed the gun close to his face, but the youth started up again. Paul jabbed viciously with the barrel and felt it strike and tear. "I don't want to have to blow your head off." The boy howled and fell back. He crouched, panting on his hands and knees, head hung low, watching a dark puddle of blood gather on the pavement from a deep gash across his cheek. "What you want to do that for?" he whimpered. "I wasn't going to hurt you." His tone was that of a wronged and rejected suitor. "Now, where is St. Mary's? Is that one of the hospitals? How do I get there?" Paul had backed to a safe distance and was covering the youth with the gun. "Straight down Broadway to the boulevard. You'll see it down that neighborhood, about the 4th Street, I think." The boy looked up, and Paul saw the extent of the gash. It was deep and ragged, and the kid was crying. "Get up. You're going to lead me there." Pain had blanketed the call of the craving. The boy struggled to his feet, pressed a handkerchief against the wound, and with an angry glance at Paul, he set out down the road. Paul followed 10 yards behind. "If you take me through any dermy traps, I'll kill you." "There aren't any traps," the youth mumbled. Paul snorted unbelief, but did not repeat the warning. "What made you think I was another dermy?" he snapped. "Because there's no non-hypers in Galveston. This is a hyper colony. A non-hyper used to drift in occasionally, but the priests had the bridge dynamited. The non-hypers upset the colony. As long as there aren't any around to smell, nobody causes any trouble. During the day, there's a guard out on the causeway, and if any hypers come looking for a place to stay, the guard ferries them across. If non-hypers come, he tells them about the colony, and they go away." Paul groaned. He had stumbled into a rat's nest. Was there no refuge from the gray curse? Now he would have to move on. It seemed a hopeless quest. Maybe the old man he met on his way to Houston had arrived at the only possible hope for peace, submission to the plague. But the thought sickened him somehow. He would have to find some barren island, find a healthy mate, and go to live a savage existence apart from all traces of civilization. "Didn't the guard stop you at the bridge?" the boy asked. "He never came back today. He must still be out there." Paul grunted no in a tone that warned against idle conversation. He guessed what had happened. The dermy guard had probably spotted some healthy wanderers, and instead of warning them away, he rode across the drawbridge and set out to chase them. His body probably lay along the highway somewhere. if the hypothetical wanderers were armed. When they reached 23rd Street, a few blocks from the heart of the city, Paul hissed at the boy to stop. He heard someone laugh. Footsteps were wandering along the sidewalk, overhung by trees. He whispered to the boy to take refuge behind a hedge. They crouched in the shadows several yards apart while the voices drew nearer. "Brother James had a nice tenor," someone said softly. "But he sings his Latin with a Western drawl. It sounds, well, peculiar, to say the least. Brother John is a stickler for pronunciation. He won't let Fra James solo. Says it gives a burlesque effect to the choir. Says it makes the sisters giggle." The other man chuckled quietly and started to reply, but his voice broke off suddenly. The footsteps stopped a dozen feet from Paul's hiding place. Paul, peering through the hedge, saw a pair of brown-robed monks standing on the sidewalk. They were looking around suspiciously. "Brother Thomas, do you smell?" I smell it." Paul changed his position slightly so as to keep the gun pointed toward the pair of plague-stricken monastics. They stood in embarrassed silence, peering into the darkness and shuffling their feet uneasily. One of them suddenly pinched his nose between thumb and forefinger. His companion followed suit. "Blessed be God," quavered one. "Blessed be his holy name," answered the other. "Blessed be Jesus Christ, true God and true man. Blessed be." Gathering their robes high about their shins, the two monks turned and scurried away, muttering the litany of the divine praises as they went. Paul stood up and stared after them in amazement. The sight of Dermes running from a potential victim was almost beyond belief. He questioned his young guide. Still holding the handkerchief against his bleeding face, the boy hung his head. "Bishop's made a ruling against touching non-hypers," he explained miserably. "Says it's a sin unless the non-hyper submits of his own free will. Says even then it's wrong except in the ordinary ways that people come in contact with each other. Calls it fleshly desire and all that." "Then why did you try to do it?" "I ain't so religious." "Well, sonny, you better get religious until we come to the hospital. Now let's go." They marched on down Broadway, encountering no other pedestrians. 20 minutes later, they were standing in the shadows before a hulking brick building, some of whose windows were yellow with lamplight. Moonlight bathed the statue of a woman standing on a ledge over the entrance, indicating to Paul that this was the hospital. "All right, boy. You go in and send out a dermy doctor. Tell him somebody wants to see him, but if you say I'm not a dermy, I'll come in and kill you. Now move, and don't come back. Stay to get your face fixed." The youth stumbled toward the entrance. Paul sat in the shadow of a tree where he could see 20 yards in all directions and guard himself against approach. Soon, a black-clad priest came out of the emergency entrance, stopped on the sidewalk, and glanced around. "Over here," Paul hissed from across the street. The priest advanced uncertainly. In the center of the road, he stopped again and held his nose. You're a non-hyper," he said almost accusingly. "That's right, and I've got a gun, so don't try anything." "What's wrong? Are you sick?" The lad said. "There's a dermy girl down the island. She's been shot. Tendon behind her heel is cut clean through. You're going to help her." "Of course, but—" The priest paused. "You, a non-hyper, helping a so-called dermy?" His voice went high with amazement. "So I'm a sucker," Paul barked. "Now get what you need and come on." "The Lord bless you," the priest mumbled in embarrassment as he hurried away. "Don't sick any of your maniacs on me," Paul called after him. "I'm armed." "I'll have to bring a surgeon," the cleric said over his shoulder. 5 minutes later, Paul heard the muffled grunt of a starter. Then an engine coughed to life. Startled, he scurried away from the tree and sought safety in a clump of shrubs. An ambulance backed out of the driveway and into the street. It parked at the curb by the tree, engine running. A pallid face glanced out curiously toward the shadows. "Where are you?" it called, but it was not the priest's voice. Paul stood up and advanced a few steps. "We'll have to wait on Father Mendelhaus," the driver called. "He'll be a few minutes." "You a dermy?" "Of course, but don't worry, I've plugged my nose and I'm wearing rubber gloves. I can't smell you. The sight of a non-hyper arouses some craving, of course, but it can be overcome with a little willpower. I won't infect you, although I don't understand why you non-hypers fight so hard. You're bound to catch it sooner or later, and the world can't get back to normal until everybody has it." Paul avoided the startling thought. "You the surgeon?" Yes, Father Williamson's the name. I'm not really a specialist, but I did some surgery in Korea. How's the girl's condition? Suffering shock?" "I wouldn't know." They fell silent until Father Mendelhaus returned. He came across the street carrying a bag in one hand and a brown bottle in the other. He held the bottle by the neck with a pair of tongs, and Paul could see the exterior of the bottle steaming slightly as the priest passed through the beam of the ambulance's headlights. He placed the flask on the curb without touching it, then spoke to the man in the shadows. "Would you step behind the hedge and disrobe, young man? Then rub yourself thoroughly with this oil." "I doubt it," Paul snapped. "What is it?" "Don't worry, it's been in the sterilizer. That's what took me so long. It may be a little hot for you, however. It's only an antiseptic and deodorant. It'll kill your odor, and it'll also give you some protection against picking up stray microorganisms." After a few moments of anxious hesitation, Paul decided to trust the priest. He carried the hot flask into the brush, undressed, and bathed himself in the warm, aromatic oil. Then he slipped back into his clothes and reapproached the ambulance. "Ride in back," Mendelhaus told him, "and you won't be infected. No one's been in there for several weeks, and as you probably know, the microorganisms die after a few hours' exposure. They have to be transmitted from skin to skin, or else an object has to be handled very soon after a hyper has touched it." Paul warily climbed inside. Mendelhaus opened a slide and spoke through it from the front seat. "You'll have to show us the way." "Straight out Broadway. Say, where did you get the gasoline for this wagon?" The priest paused. "That has been something of a secret." "Oh well, I'll tell you. There's a tanker out in the harbor. The people left town too quickly to think of it. Automobiles are scarcer than fuel in Galveston. Up north you find them stalled everywhere. But since Galveston didn't have any through traffic, there were no cars running out of gas. The ones we have are the ones that were left in the repair shop. Something wrong with them, and we don't have any mechanics to fix them." Paul neglected to mention that he was qualified for the job. The priest might get ideas. He fell into gloomy silence as the ambulance turned onto Broadway and headed down Island. He watched the back of the priests' heads silhouetted against the headlighted pavement. They seemed not at all concerned about their disease. Mendelhaus was a slender man with a blond crew cut and rather bushy eyebrows. He had a thin, aristocratic face, now plague gray, but jovial enough. It might be the face of an ascetic, but for the quick blue eyes that seemed full of lively interest rather than inward-turning mysticism. Williamson, on the other hand, was a rather plain man with a stolid, tweedy look, despite his black cassock. "What do you think of our plan here?" asked Father Mendelhaus. "What plan?" Paul grunted. "Oh, didn't the boy tell you? We're trying to make the island a refuge for hypers who are willing to sublimate their craving and turn their attentions toward reconstruction. We're also trying to make an objective study of this neural condition. We have some good scientific minds, too. Dr. Relmone of Fordham, Father Sayes of Notre Dame, 2 biologists from Boston College." "Dermies trying to cure the plague?" Paul gasped. Mendelhaus laughed merrily. "I didn't say cure it, son. I said study it." "Why?" "To learn how to live with it, of course. It's been pointed out by our philosophers that things become evil only through human misuse. Morphine, for instance, is a product of the Creator. It is therefore good when properly used for relief of pain. When mistreated by an addict, it becomes a monster. We bear this in mind as we study neuroderm." Paul snorted contemptuously. "Leprosy is evil, I suppose, because man mistreated bacteria?" The priest laughed again. "You've got me there. I'm no philosopher, but you can't compare neuroderm with leprosy." Paul shuddered. "The hell I can't. It's worse." "Ah, suppose you tell me what makes it worse. List the symptoms for me." Paul hesitated, listing them mentally. They were discoloration of the skin, low fever, hallucinations, and the insane craving to infect others. They seemed bad enough, so he listed them orally. "Of course, people don't die of it," he added. "But which is worse, insanity or death?" The priest turned to smile back at him through the porthole. "Would you call me insane? It's true that victims have frequently lost their minds, but that's not a direct result of neuroderm. Tell me, how would you feel if everyone screamed and ran when they saw you coming, or hunted you down like a criminal? How long would your sanity last?" Paul said nothing. Perhaps the anathema was a contributing factor. Unless you were very sound of mind to begin with, you probably couldn't endure it. But the craving and the hallucinations. "True," murmured the priest thoughtfully. "The hallucinations. Tell me something else. If all the world was blind save one man, wouldn't the world be inclined to call that man's sight a hallucination? And the man with eyes might even come to agree with the world." Again, Paul was silent. There was no arguing with Mendelhaus, who probably suffered the strange delusions and thought them real. "And the craving," the priest went on. "It's true that the craving can be a rather unpleasant symptom. It's the condition's way of perpetuating itself. Although we're not certain how it works, it seems to be able to stimulate erotic sensations in the hands. We do know the micro-organisms get to the brain, but we're not yet sure what they do there." "What facts have you discovered?" Paul asked cautiously. Mendelhaus grinned at him. "Tut! I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to be called a crazy dermy. You wouldn't believe me, you see." Paul glanced outside and saw that they were approaching the vicinity of the fishing cottage. He pointed out the lamplit window to the driver, and the ambulance turned onto a side road. Soon they were parked behind the shanty. The priests scrambled out and carried the stretcher toward the light, while Paul skulked to a safer distance and sat down in the grass to watch. When Willie was safe in the vehicle, he meant to walk back to the bridge, swim across the gap, and return to the mainland. Soon Mendelhaus came out and walked toward him with a solemn stride, although Paul was sitting quietly in the deepest shadow, invisible, he had thought. He arose quickly as the priest approached. Anxiety tightened his throat. Is Willie? She's irrational, Mendelhaus murmured sadly. Almost less than sane. Some of it may be due to high fever, but... Yes. She tried to kill herself. With a knife. Said something about buckshot being the best way or something. Jesus. Paul sank weakly in the grass and covered his face with his hands. Blessed be his holy name, murmured the priest by way of turning the oath aside. She didn't hurt herself badly, though. Wrists cut a little. She was too weak to do a real job of it. Father Will's giving her a hypo and a tetanus shot and some sulfa. We're out of penicillin. He stopped speaking and watched Paul's wretchedness for a moment. You love the girl, don't you? Paul stiffened. Are you crazy? Love a little tramp dermy? Jesus! Blessed be. Listen, will she be all right? I'm getting out of here. He climbed unsteadily to his feet. I don't know, son. Infection's the real threat, and shock. If we'd got to her sooner, she'd have been safer, and if she was in the ultimate stage of neuroderm, it would help. Why? Oh, various reasons. You'll learn someday. But listen, you look exhausted. Why don't you come back to the hospital with us? The 3rd floor is entirely vacant. There's no danger of infection up there, and we keep a sterile room ready just in case we get a non-hyper case. You can lock the door inside if you want to, but it wouldn't be necessary. Nuns are on the floor below. Our male staff lives in the basement. There aren't any laymen in the building. I'll guarantee that you won't be bothered. No, I've got to go, he growled, then softened his voice. I appreciate it, though, Father. Whatever you wish. I'm sorry, though. You might be able to provide yourself with some kind of transportation if you waited. I don't mind telling you, your island makes me jumpy. Why? Paul glanced at the priest's gray hands. Well, you still feel the craving, don't you? Mendelhaus touched his nose. Cotton plugs with a little camphor. I can't smell you. He hesitated. No, I won't lie to you. The urge to touch is still there to some extent. And in a moment of weakness, somebody might... The priest straightened his shoulders. His eyes went chilly. I have taken certain vows, young man. Sometimes when I see a beautiful woman, I feel desire. When I see a man eating a thick steak on a fast day, I feel envy and hunger. When I see a doctor earning large fees, I chafe under the vow of poverty. But by denying desire's demands, one learns to make desire useful in other ways. Sublimation, some call it. A priest can use it and do more useful work thereby. I am a priest. He nodded curtly, turned on his heel, and strode away. Halfway to the cottage, he paused. She's calling for someone named Paul. Know who it might be? Family, perhaps? Paul stood speechless. The priest shrugged and continued toward the lighted doorway. Father, wait. Yes? I am a little tired. The room, I mean. Will you show me where to get transportation tomorrow? Certainly. Before midnight, the party had returned to the hospital. Paul lay on a comfortable mattress for the first time in weeks, sleepless and staring at the moonlight on the sill. Somewhere downstairs, Willie was lying unconscious in an operating room while the surgeon tried to repair the torn tendon. Paul had ridden back with them in the ambulance, sitting a few feet from the stretcher, avoiding her sometimes wandering arms and listening to her delirious moaning. Now, he felt his skin crawling with belated hypochondria. What a fool he had been, touching the rope, the boat, the wheelbarrow, riding in the ambulance. There were 1,000 ways he could have picked up a few stray micro-organisms lingering from a dermy's touch, and now he lay here in this nest of disease. But strange, it was the most peaceful, the sanest place he'd seen in months. The religious orders simply accepted the plague with masochistic complacency, perhaps, but calmly. A cross or a penance or something, but no, they seemed to accept it almost gladly. Nothing peculiar about that. All dermies went wild-eyed with happiness about the lovely desire they possessed. The priests weren't wild-eyed. Neither was normal man equipped with socially shaped sexual desire. Sublimation. Peace, he muttered, and went to sleep. A knocking at the door awoke him at dawn. He grunted at it disgustedly and sat up in bed. The door, which he had forgotten to lock, swung open. A chubby nun with a breakfast tray started into the room. She saw his face, then stopped. She closed her eyes, wrinkled her nose, and framed a silent prayer with her lips. Then she backed slowly out. "I'm sorry, sir," she quavered through the door. I knew there was a patient in here, but I didn't know you weren't a hyper. Forgive me." He heard her scurrying away down the hall. Somehow, he began to feel safe, but wasn't that exactly what they wanted him to feel? He realized suddenly that he was trapped. He had left the shotgun in the emergency room. What was he, guest or captive? Months of fleeing from the gray terror had left him suspicious. Soon he would find out. He arose and began dressing. Before he finished, Mendelhaus came. He did not enter, but stood in the hallway behind the door. He smiled a faint greeting and said, "So you're Paul." He felt heat rising in his face. "She's awake, then?" he asked gruffly. The priest nodded. "Want to see her?" "No. I've got to be going." "It would do her good." He coughed angrily. Why did the black-cassocked dermy have to put it that way? "Well, it wouldn't do me any good," he snarled. "I've been around too many gray leather hides already." Mendelhaus shrugged, but his eyes bore a hint of contempt. "As you wish. You may leave by the outside stairway to avoid disturbing the sisters." "To avoid being touched, you mean?" "No one will touch you." Paul finished dressing in silence. The reversal of attitudes disturbed him. He resented the seeming tolerance that was being extended him. It was like asylum inmates being tolerant of the psychiatrist. "I'm ready," he growled. Mendelhaus led him down the corridor and out onto a sunlit balcony. They descended a stone stairway while the priest talked over his shoulder. "She's still not fully rational, and there's some fever. It wouldn't be anything to worry about 2 years ago, but now we're out of most of the latest drugs. If sulfa won't hold the infection, we'll have to amputate, of course. We should know in 2 or 3 days." He paused and looked back at Paul, who had stopped on the stairway. "Coming?" "Where is she?" Paul asked weakly. "I'll see her." The priest frowned. "You don't have to, son. I'm sorry if I implied any obligation on your part. Really, you've done enough. I gather that you saved her life. Very few non-hypers would do a thing like that. Where is she? He snapped angrily. The priest nodded. Downstairs. Come on. As they re-entered the building on the ground floor, the priest cupped his hands to his mouth and called out, Non-hyper coming. Plug your noses or get out of the way. Avoid circumstances of temptation. When they moved along the corridor, it was Paul who felt like the leper. Mendelhaus led him into the third room. Willie saw him enter and hid her gray hands beneath the sheet. She smiled faintly, tried to sit up, and failed. Williamson and a nun nurse, who had both been standing by the bedside, turned to leave the room. Mendelhaus followed them out and closed the door. There was a long, painful pause. Willie tried to grin. He shuffled his feet. They've got me in a cast, she said conversationally. You'll be all right, he said hastily. It won't be long before you'll be up. Galveston's a good place for you. They're all dermies here. She clenched her eyes tightly shut. God, I hope I never hear that word again. After last night, that old woman in the rocking chair. I stayed there all alone, and the wind had started the chair rocking. Oh. She looked at him with abnormally bright eyes. I'd rather die than touch anybody now, after seeing that. Somebody touched her, didn't they, Paul? That's why she did it, wasn't it? He squirmed and backed toward the door. Willie, I'm sorry for what I said. I mean, don't worry, Paul. I wouldn't touch you now. She clenched her hands and brought them up before her face to stare at them with glittering hate. I loathe myself, she hissed. What was it Mendelhaus had said about the dermy going insane because of being an outcast rather than because of the plague? But she wouldn't be an outcast here, only among non-hypers like himself. Get well quick, Willie, he muttered, then hurriedly slipped out into the corridor. She called his name twice, then fell silent. That was quick, murmured Mendelhaus, glancing at his pale face. Where can I get a car? The priest rubbed his chin. I was just speaking to Brother Matthew about that. How would you like to have a small yacht instead? Paul caught his breath. A yacht would mean access to the seas and to an island. A yacht was the perfect solution. He stammered gratefully. Good, said Mendelhaus. There's a small craft in dry dock down at the basin. It was apparently left there because there weren't any dock crews around to get her afloat again. I took the liberty of asking Brother Matthew to find some men and get her in the water. Dermies? Of course. The boat will be fumigated, but it isn't really necessary. The infection dies out in a few hours. It'll take a while, of course, to get the boat ready. Tomorrow? Next day, maybe? Bottom's cracked. It'll need some patching. Paul's smile weakened. More delay. 2 more days of living in the gray shadow. Was the priest really to be trusted? Why should he even provide the boat? The jaws of an invisible trap, slowly closing. Mendelhaus saw his doubt. If you'd rather leave now, you're free to do so. We're really not going to as much trouble as it might seem. There are several yachts at the dock. Brother Matthew's been preparing to clean 1 or 2 up for our own use, and we might as well let you have one. They've been deserted by their owners, and, well, you helped the girl when nobody else would have done so. Consider the boat as our way of returning the favor, eh? A yacht. The open sea. a semi-tropical island, uninhabited, on the brink of the Caribbean. And a woman, of course, chosen from among the many who would be willing to share such an escape. Peculiarly, he glanced at Willie's door. It was too bad about her, but she'd get along okay. The yacht, if he were only certain of Mendelhaus's intentions. The priest began frowning at Paul's hesitation. Well, I don't want to put you to any trouble. Nonsense. You're still afraid of us. Very well. Come with me. There's someone I want you to see. Mendelhaus turned and started down the corridor. Paul lingered. Who? What? Come on, the priest snapped impatiently. Reluctantly, Paul followed him to the stairway. They descended to a gloomy basement and entered a smelly laboratory through a double door. Electric illumination startled him. Then he heard the sound of a gasoline engine and knew that the power was generated locally. Germicidal lamps, murmured the priest, following his ceilingward gaze. Some of them are. Don't worry about touching things. It's sterile in here. But it's not sterile for your convenience, growled an invisible voice. And it won't be sterile at all if you don't stay out. Beat it, preacher. Paul looked for the source of the voice and saw a small, short-necked man bending his shaggy gray head over a microscope at the other end of the lab. He had spoken without glancing up at his visitors. This is Dr. Sievers of Princeton, son, said the priest, unruffled by the scientist's ire. Claims he's an atheist, but personally, I think he's a Puritan. Doctor, this is the young man I was telling you about. Will you tell him what you know about neuroderm? Sievers jotted something on a pad but kept his eye to the instrument. Why don't we just give it to him and let him find out for himself? The scientist grumbled sadistically. Don't frighten him, you heretic. I brought him here to be illuminated. Illuminate him yourself. I'm busy. And stop calling me names. I'm not an atheist. I'm a biochemist. Yesterday you were a biophysicist. Now entertain my young man. Mendelhaus blocked the doorway with his body. Paul, with his jaw clenched angrily, had turned to leave. That's all I can do, preacher, Sievers grunted. Entertain him? I know nothing, absolutely nothing. I have some observed data. I have noticed some correlations. I have seen things happen. I have traced the patterns of the happenings and found some probable common denominators, and that is all. I admit it. Why don't you preachers admit it in your racket? Sievers, as you can see, is inordinately proud of his humility, if that's not a paradox, the priest said to Paul. Now, doctor, this young man, Sievers heaved a resigned sigh. His voice went sour-sweet. All right, sit down, young man. I'll entertain you as soon as I get through counting free nerve endings in this piece of skin. Mendelhaus winked at his guest. Sievers calls it masochism when we observe a fast day or do penance, and there he sits, ripping off patches of his own hide to look at through his peeping glass. Masochism. Get out, preacher, the scientist bellowed. Mendelhaus laughed mockingly, nodded Paul toward a chair, and left the lab. Paul sat uneasily watching the back of Sievers' lab jacket. Nice bunch of people, really, these black-frocked yahoos, Sievers murmured conversationally. If they'd just stop trying to convert me. Dr. Sievers, maybe I'd better. Quiet! You bother me. And sit still, I can't stand to have people running in and out of here. You're in? Now stay in. Paul fell silent. He was uncertain whether or not Sievers was a dermy. The small man's lab jacket bunched up to hide the back of his neck, and the sleeves covered his arms. His hands were rubber-gloved, and a knot of white cord behind his head told Paul that he was wearing a gauze mask. His ears were bright pink, but their color was meaningless. It took several months for the gray coloring to seep to all areas of the skin, but Paul guessed he was a dermy, and wearing the gloves and mask to keep his equipment sterile. He glanced idly around the large room. There were several glass cages of rats against the wall. They seemed airtight with ducts for forced ventilation. About half the rats were afflicted with neuroderm in its various stages. A few wore shaved patches of skin where the disease had been freshly and forcibly inflicted. Paul caught the fleeting impression that several of the animals were staring at him fixedly. He shuddered and looked away. He glanced casually at the usual maze of laboratory glassware, then turned his attention to a pair of hemispheres suspended like a trophy on the wall. He recognized them as the twin halves of one of the meteorites, with the small jelly pocket in the center. Beyond it hung a large picture frame containing several typewritten sheets. Another frame held 4 pictures of bearded scientists from another century, obviously clipped from a magazine or textbook. There was nothing spectacular about the lab. It smelled of clean dust and sour things. Just a small, respectable workshop. Sievers's chair creaked suddenly. "It checks," he said to himself. "It checks again. 40% increase." He threw down the stub pencil and whirled suddenly. Paul saw a pudgy, round face with glittering eyes. A dark splotch of neuroderm had crept up from the chin to split his mouth and cover one cheek and an eye, giving him the appearance of a black and white bulldog with a mixed-color muzzle. "It checks," he barked at Paul, then smirked contentedly. "What checks?" The scientist rolled up a sleeve to display a patch of adhesive tape on a portion of his arm which had been discolored by the disease. "Here," he grunted. 2 weeks ago, this area was normal. I took a centimeter of skin from right next to this one and counted the nerve endings. Since that time, the derms crept down over the area. I took another square centimeter today and recounted. 40% increase. Paul frowned with disbelief. It was generally known that neuroderm had a sensitizing effect, but new nerve endings. No, he didn't believe it. "3rd time I've checked it," Sievers said happily. "One place ran up to 65%. Smart little bugs, aren't they? Inventing new somacetic receptors that way." Paul swallowed with difficulty. "What did you say?" he gasped. Sievers inspected him serenely. "So, you're a non-hyper, are you?" "Yes, indeed. I can smell that you are. Vile, really. Can't understand why sensible hypers would want to paw you, but then I've insured myself against such foolishness." He said it so casually that Paul blinked before he caught the full impact of it. "You've done what?" "What I said. When I first caught it, I simply sat down with a velvet-tipped stylus and located the spots on my hands that gave rise to pleasurable sensations. Then I burned them out with an electric needle. There aren't many of them, really, 1 or 2 points per square centimeter." He tugged off his gloves and exhibited pick-marked palms to prove it. "I didn't want to be bothered with such silly urges. Waste of time. chasing non-hypers. For me it is. I never learned what it's like, so I've never missed it. He turned his hands over and stared at them. Stubborn little critters. Keep growing new ones, and I keep burning them out. Paul leaped to his feet. Are you trying to tell me that the plague causes new nerve cells to grow? Sievers looked up coldly. Oh, yes. You came here to be illuminated, as the Padre put it. If you wish to be de-idiotized, please stop shouting, otherwise I'll ask you to leave. Paul, who had felt like leaving a moment ago, now subsided quickly. I'm sorry, he snapped, then softened his tone to repeat. I'm sorry. Sievers took a deep breath, stretched his short, meaty arms in an unexpected yawn, then relaxed and grinned. Sit down, my boy. I'll tell you what you want to know, if you really want to know anything. Do you? Of course. You don't. You just want to know how you, whatever your name is, will be affected by events. You don't care about understanding for its own sake. Few people do. That's why we're in this mess. The Padre, now, he cares about understanding events, but not for their own sake. He cares, but for his flock's sake and for his God's sake, which is, I must admit, a better attitude than that of the common herd whose only interest is in their own safety. But if people would just want to understand events for the understanding's sake, we wouldn't be in such a pickle. Paul watched the professor's bright eyes and took the lecture quietly. And so, before I illuminate you, I want to make an impossible request. Yes, sir? I ask you to be completely objective. Sievers continued, rubbing the bridge of his nose and covering his eyes with his hand. I want you to forget you ever heard of neuroderm while you listen to me. Rid yourself of all preconceptions, especially those connected with fear. Pretend these are purely hypothetical events that I'm going to discuss. He took his hands down from his eyes and grinned sheepishly. It always embarrasses me to ask for that kind of cooperation when I know damn well I'll never get it. I'll try to be objective, sir. Ah! Sievers slid down to sit on his spine and hooked the base of his skull over the back of the chair. He blinked thoughtfully at the ceiling for a moment, then folded his hands across his small paunch and closed his eyes. When he spoke again, he was speaking to himself. Assume a planet, somewhat Earth-like but not quite. It has carboniferous life forms, but not human. Warm-blooded, probably, and semi-intelligent. And the planet has something else, an overabundance of parasite forms. Actually, the various types of parasites are the dominant species. The warm-blooded animals are the parasites, vegetables, so to speak. Now, during 2 billion years, say, of survival contests between parasite species, some parasites are quite likely to develop some curious methods of adaptation, methods of ensuring the food supply, animals who must have been taking a beating. Sievers glanced down from the ceiling. Tell me, youngster, what major activity did man invent to secure his vegetable food supply? Agriculture? Certainly. Man is a parasite as far as vegetables are concerned, but he learned to eat his cake and have it too. He learned to perpetuate the species he was devouring. A very remarkable idea if you stop to think about it. Very. I don't see— Hush! Now, let's suppose that one species of micro-parasites on our hypothetical planet learned through long evolutionary processes to stimulate regrowth in the animal tissue they devoured, through exuding controlled amounts of growth hormone, I think. Quite an advancement, eh? Paul had begun leaning forward tensely. But it's only the first step. It let the host live longer, although not pleasantly, I imagine. The growth control would be clumsy at first, but soon all parasite species either learned to do it or died out. Then came the contest for the best kind of control. The parasites who kept their hosts in the best physical condition naturally did a better job of survival, since the parasite ascendancy had cut down on the food supply, just as man wastes his own resources, and since animals were contending among themselves for a place in the sun, it was to the parasite's advantage to help ensure the survival of his host species through growth control. Sievers winked solemnly. Now begins the downfall of the parasites, their decadence. They concentrated all their efforts along the lines of, scientific farming, you might say. They began growing various sorts of defense and attack weapons for their hosts, weird biodevices, perhaps. Horns, swords, fangs, stingers, poison throwers. We can only guess. But eventually, one group of parasites hit upon what? Paul, who was beginning to stir uneasily, could only stammer. Where was Sievers getting all this? "Say it!" the scientist demanded. "The nervous system?" "That's right. You don't need to whisper it. The nervous system. It was probably an unsuccessful parasite at first, because nerve tissue grows slowly, and it's a long stretch of evolution between a microspecies which could stimulate nerve growth and one which could direct and utilize that growth for the host's advantage and for its own. But at last, after a long struggle, our little species gets there. It begins sharpening the host's senses, building up complex senses from aggregates of old-style receptors and increasing the host's intelligence within limits." Sievers grinned mischievously. "Comes a planetary shake-up of the first magnitude. Such parasites would naturally pick the host species with the highest intelligence to begin with. With the extra boost, this brainy animal quickly beats down its own enemies, and consequently the enemies of its micro-benefactor. It puts itself in much the same position that man's in on Earth. Lorded over the beasts, divine right to run the place and all that. Now, understand, it's the animal who's become intelligent, not the parasites. The parasites are operating on complex instinct patterns like a hive of bees. They're wonderful neurological engineers, like bees are good structural engineers. Blind instinct, accumulated through evolution." He paused to light a cigarette. "If you feel ill, young man, there's drinking water in that bottle. You look ill." "I'm all right." "Well, to continue. The intelligent animal became master of his planet. Threats to his existence were overcome, unless he was a threat to himself, like we are. But now the parasites had found a safe home. No new threats to force readaptation. They sat back and sighed and became stagnant, as unchanging as horseshoe crabs or amoeba or other earth ancients. They kept right on working in their neurological beehives, and now they became cultivated by the animal, who recognized their benefactors. They didn't know it, but they were no longer the dominant species. They had ensured their survival by leaning on their animal prop, who now took care of them with godlike charity and selfishness. The parasites had achieved biological heaven. They kept on working, but they stopped fighting. The host was their welfare state, you might say. End of a sequence. He blew a long breath of smoke and leaned forward to watch Paul with casual amusement. Paul suddenly realized that he was sitting on the edge of his chair and gaping. He forced a relaxation. Wild guesswork, he breathed uncertainly. Some of it's guesswork, Sievers admitted, but none of it's wild. There is supporting evidence. It's in the form of a message. Message? Sure. Come, I'll show you. Sievers arose and moved toward the wall. He stopped before the two hemispheres. On second thought, you better show yourself. Take down that sliced meteorite, will you? It's sterile. Paul crossed the room, climbed unsteadily upon a bench, and brought down the globular meteorite. It was the first time he had examined one of the things, and he inspected it curiously. It was a near-perfect sphere, about 8 inches in diameter, with a 4-inch hollow in the center. The globe was made up of several concentric shells, tightly fitted, each apparently of a different metal. It was not seemingly heavier than aluminum, although the outer shell was obviously of tough steel. Set it face down, Sievers told him. Both halves. Give it a quick little twist. The shells will come apart. Take out the center shell, the hard, thin one between the soft, protecting shells. How do you know their purposes? Paul growled as he followed instructions. The shells came apart easily. Envelopes are to protect messages, snorted Sievers. Paul sorted out the hemispheres and found 2 mirror-polished shells of paper-thin, tough metal. They bore no inscription, either inside or out. He gave Sievers a puzzled frown. Handle them carefully while they're out of the protectors. They're already a little blurred. I don't see any message. There's a small bottle of iron filings in that drawer by your knee. Sift them carefully over the outside of the shells. That powder isn't fine enough, really, but it's the best I could do. Felger had some better stuff up at Princeton before we all got out. This business wasn't my discovery, incidentally. Baffled, Paul found the iron filings and dusted the mirror shells with the powder. Delicate patterns appeared, latitudinal circles etched in iron dust and laced here and there with diagonal lines. He gasped. It looked like the map of a planet. I know what you're thinking, Sievers said. That's what we thought too at first. Then Felger came up with this very fine dust. Fine as they are, those lines are rows of pictograph symbols. You can make them out vaguely with a good reading glass, even with this coarse stuff. It's magnetic printing, like 2-dimensional wire recording. Evidently, the animals that printed it had either very powerful eyes or a magnetic sense. Anyone understand it? Princeton staff was working on it when the world went crazy. They figured out enough to guess at what I've just told you. They found 5 different shell messages among a dozen or so spheres. One of them was a sort of key, a symbol equated to a diagram of a carbon atom. Another symbol equated to a pi in binary numbers, things like that. About 500 symbols, in fact. Some we couldn't figure. Then they defined other symbols by what amounted to blank-filling quizzes. Things like, a star is... and there would be the unknown symbol. We would try to decide whether it meant hot, white, huge, and so forth. And you managed it? In part. The ruthless way in which the missiles were opened destroyed some of the clarity. The senders were guilty of their own brand of anthropomorphism. They projected their own psychology on us. They expected us to open the things shell by shell cautiously and figure out the text before we went further. What happens? Some machinist grabs one, shakes it, weighs it, sticks it on a lathe, and brrr. Our curiosity is still rather ape-like. Stick our arm in a gopher hole to see if there's a rattlesnake inside. There was a long silence while Paul stood peering over the patterns on the shell. Why haven't people heard about this? He asked quietly. Heard about it? Sievers roared. And how do you propose to tell them about it? Paul shook his head. It was easy to forget that man had scurried away from his presses and his broadcasting stations and his railroads, leaving his mechanical creatures to sleep in their own rust while he fled like a bee-stung bear before the strange terror. What exactly do the patterns say, Doctor? I've told you some of it. The evolutionary origin of the neuroderm parasites. We also pieced together their reasons for launching the missiles across space several thousand years ago. Their sun was about to flare into a supernova. They worked out a theoretical space drive, but they couldn't fuel it, needed some element that was scarce in their system. They could get to their outer planet, but that wouldn't help much, so they just cultured up a batch of their parasite benefactors, rolled them into these balls, and fired them like charges of buckshot at various stars. Interception course, naturally. They meant to miss just a little so that the projectiles would swing into long elliptical orbits around the suns, close enough in to intersect the radiational life belt and eventually cross paths with planets whose orbits were near circular. Looks like they hit us on the first pass. You mean they weren't aiming at Earth in particular? Evidently not. They couldn't know we were here. Not at a range like that. Hundreds of light years. They just took a chance on several stars. Shipping off their pets was sort of a last-ditch stand against extinction. Symbolic, to be sure, but a noble gesture as far as they were concerned. A giving away of part of their souls. Like a man writing his will and leaving his last worldly possession to some unknown species beyond the stars. Imagine them standing there, watching the projectiles being fired out toward deep space. There goes their inheritance to an unknown heir, or perhaps to no one, the little creatures that brought them up from beasthood. Sievers paused, staring at the sunlight beyond the high basement window. He was talking to himself again, quietly. You can see them turn away and silently go back, to wait for their collapsing sun to reach the critical point, the detonating point, They've left their last mark, a dark and uncertain benediction to the cosmos. You're a fool, Sievers, Paul grunted suddenly. Sievers whirled, whitening. His hand darted out forgetfully toward the young man's arm, but he drew it back as Paul sidestepped. You actually regard this thing as desirable, don't you? Paul asked. You can't see that you're under its effect. Why does it affect people that way? And you say I can't be objective. The professor smiled coldly. I didn't say it's desirable. I was simply pointing out that the beings who sent it saw it as desirable. They were making some unwarranted assumptions. Maybe they just didn't care. Of course they cared. Their fallacy was that we would open it as they would have done, cautiously. Perhaps they couldn't see how a creature could be both brash and intelligent. They meant for us to read the warning on the shells before we went further. Warning? Sievers smiled bitterly. Yes, warning. There was one group of oversized symbols on all the spheres. See that pattern on the top ring? It says, in effect, Finder creatures, you who destroy your own people, if you do this thing, then destroy this container without penetrating deeper. If you are self-destroyers, then the contents will only help to destroy you. There was a frigid silence. But somebody would have opened one anyway, Paul protested. Sievers turned his bitter smile on the window. You couldn't be more right. The senders just didn't foresee our monkey-minded species. If they saw man digging out the nuggets, braying over them, chortling over them, cracking them like walnuts, then turning tail to run howling for the forests, well, they'd think twice before they fired another round of their celestial buckshot. Dr. Sievers, what do you think will happen now? To the world, I mean. Sievers shrugged. I saw a baby born yesterday to a woman down the island. It was fully covered with neuroderm at birth. It has some new sensory equipment, small pores in the fingertips with taste buds and olfactory cells in them. Also a nodule above each eye sensitive to infrared. Paul groaned. It's not the first case. Those things are happening to adults too, but you have to have the conditions for quite a while. Brother Thomas has the finger pores already. Hasn't learned to use them yet, of course. He gets sensations from them, but the receptors aren't connected to olfactory and taste centers of the brain. They're still linked with the somacetic interpretive centers. He can touch various substances and get different perceptive combinations of heat, pain, cold, pressure, and so forth. He says vinegar feels ice cold, quinine sharp hot, cologne warm velvet prickly, and he blushes when he touches a musky perfume. Paul laughed, and the hollow sound startled him. It may be several generations before we know all that will happen, Sievers went on. I've examined sections of rat brain and found the micro-organisms. They may be working at rerouting these new receptors to proper brain areas. Our grandchildren, if man's still on Earth by then, can perhaps taste-analyze substances by touch, qualitatively determine the contents of a test tube by sticking a finger in it. See a warm radiator in a dark room by infrared. Perhaps there'll be some ultraviolet sensitization. My rats are sensitive to it. Paul went to the rat cages and stared in at 3 gray-pelted animals that seemed larger than the others. They retreated against the back wall and watched him warily. They began squeaking and exchanging glances among themselves. "Those are third-generation hypers," Sievers told him. "They've developed a simple language, not intelligent by human standards, but crafty. They've learned to use their sensory equipment. They know when I mean to feed them and when I mean to take one out and kill and dissect. A slight change in my emotional odor, I imagine. Learning's a big hurdle, youngster. A hyper with finger pores gets sensations from them, but it takes a long time to attach meaning to the various sensations through learning. A baby gets visual sensations from his untrained eyes, but the sensation is utterly without significance until he associates milk with white, mother with the face shape, and so forth." "What will happen to the brain?" Paul breathed. "Not too much, I imagine. I haven't observed much happening. The rats show an increase in intelligence, but not in brain size. The intellectual boost apparently comes from an ability to perceive things in terms of more senses. Ideas, concepts, precepts are made of memory collections of past sensory experiences. An apple is red, fruity smelling, sweet acid flavored. That's your sensory idea of an apple. A blind man without a tongue couldn't form such a complete idea. A hyper, on the other hand, could add some new adjectives that you couldn't understand. The fully developed hyper, I'm not one yet, has more sensory tools with which to grasp ideas. When he learns to use them, he'll be mentally more efficient. But there's apparently a hitch. The parasite's instinctive goal is to ensure the host's survival. That's the substance of the warning. If man has the capacity to work together, then the parasites will help him shape his environment. If man intends to keep fighting with his fellows, the parasite will help him do a better job of that, too. Help him destroy himself more efficiently. Men have worked together in small tribes, Sievers interrupted. Yes, we have group spirit, ape tribe spirit, not race spirit. Paul moved restlessly toward the door. Sievers had turned to watch him with a cool smirk. "Well, you're illuminated, youngster. Now, what do you intend to do?" Paul shook his head to scatter the confusion of ideas. What can anyone do, except run, to an island, perhaps? Sievers hoisted a cynical eyebrow. "Intend taking the condition with you? Or will you try to stay non-hyper?" "Take? Are you crazy? I mean to stay healthy." "That's what I thought. If you were objective about this, you'd give yourself the condition and get it over with. I did. You remind me of a monkey running away from a hypodermic needle. The hypo has serum health insurance in it, but the needle looks sharp. The monkey chatters with fright." Paul stalked angrily to the door, then paused. "There's a girl upstairs, a dermy. Would you—" "Tell her all this? I always brief new hypers. It's one of my duties around this ecclesiastical leper ranch. She's on the verge of insanity, I suppose they all are, before they get rid of the idea that they're damned souls. What's she to you?" Paul strode out into the corridor without answering. He felt physically ill. He hated Severs's smug, bulldog face with a violence that was unfamiliar to him. The man had given the plague to himself. So he said. But was it true? Was any of it true? To claim that the hallucinations were new sensory phenomena, to pose the plague as possibly desirable, Severs had no patent on those ideas. Every dermy made such claims. It was a symptom. Severs had simply invented clever rationalizations to support his delusions, and Paul had been clearly taken in. Severs was clever. Do you mean to take the condition with you when you go? Wasn't that just another way of suggesting, why don't you allow me to touch you? Paul was shivering as he returned to the third-floor room to recoat himself with the pungent oil. Why not leave now, he thought. But he spent the day wandering along the waterfront, stopping briefly at the docks to watch a crew of monks scrambling over the scaffolding that surrounded the hulls of two small seagoing vessels. The monks were caulking split seams and trotting along the platforms with buckets of tar and paint. Upon inquiry, Paul learned which of the vessels was intended for his own use, and he put aside all thoughts of immediate departure. She was a 50-footer, a slender craft with a weighted fin keel that would cut too deep for bay navigation. Paul guessed that the colony wanted only a flat-bottomed vessel for hauling passengers and cargo across from the mainland. They would have little use for the trim seaster with the lines of a baby destroyer. Upon closer examination, he guessed that it had been a police boat or Coast Guard craft. There was a gun mounting on the forward deck, minus the gun. She was built for speed and powered by diesels, and she could be provisioned for a nice, long cruise. Paul went to scrounge among the warehouses and locate a stock of supplies. He met an occasional monk or nun, but the gray-skinned monastics seemed only desirous of avoiding him. The dermy desire was keyed principally by smell, and the deodorant oil helped preserve him from their affections. Once he was approached by a wild-eyed layman who startled him amidst a heap of warehouse crates. The dermy was almost upon him before Paul heard the footfall. Caught without an escape route and assailed by startled terror, he shattered the man's arm with a shotgun blast, then fled from the warehouse to escape the dermy's screams. Choking with shame, he found a dermy monk and sent him to care for the wounded creature. Paul had shot at other plague victims when there was no escape, but never with intent to kill. The man's life had been spared only by hasty aim. It was self-defense, he reminded himself. But defense against what? Against the inevitable? He hurried back to the hospital and found Mendelhaus outside the small chapel. I better not wait for your boat, he told the priest. I just shot one of your people. I better leave before it happens again. Mendelhaus's thin lips tightened. You shot? Didn't kill him, Paul explained hastily. Broke his arm. One of the brothers is bringing him over. I'm sorry, Father, but he jumped me. The priest glanced aside silently, apparently wrestling against anger. I'm glad you told me, he said quietly. I suppose you couldn't help it, but why did you leave the hospital? You're safe here. The yacht will be provisioned for you. I suggest you remain in your room until it's ready. I won't vouch for your safety any farther than the building. There was a tone of command in his voice, and Paul nodded slowly. He started away. The young lady's been asking for you, the priest called after him. Paul stopped. How is she? over the crisis, I think. Infection's down, nervous condition not so good, deep depression. Sometimes she goes a little hysterical." He paused, then lowered his voice. "You're at the focus of it, young man. Sometimes she gets the idea that she touched you, and then sometimes she raves about how she wouldn't do it." Paul whirled angrily, forming a protest, but the priest continued. "Sievers talked to her, and then a psychologist, one of our sisters. It seemed to help some. She's asleep now. I don't know how much of Sievers's talk she understood, however. She's dazed. Combined effects of pain, shock, infection, guilt feelings, fright, hysteria, and some other things. Morphine doesn't make her mind any clearer. Neither does the fact that she thinks you're avoiding her." "It's the plague I'm avoiding," Paul snapped, "not her." Mendelhaus chuckled mirthlessly. "You're talking to me, aren't you?" He turned and entered the chapel through a swinging door. As the door fanned back and forth, Paul caught a glimpse of a candle-lit altar and a stark wooden crucifix and a sea of monk robes flowing over the pews, waiting for the celebrant priest to enter the sanctuary and begin the sacrifice of the Mass. He realized, vaguely, that it was Sunday. Paul wandered back to the main corridor and found himself drifting toward Willie's room. The door was ajar, and he stopped short lest she see him. But after a moment, he inched forward until he caught a glimpse of her dark mass of hair unfurled across the pillow. One of the sisters had combed it for her, and it spread in dark waves, gleaming in the candlelight. She was still asleep. The candle startled him for an instant, suggesting a deathbed and the sacrament of the dying. But a dog-eared magazine lay beneath it. Someone had been reading to her. He stood in the doorway, watching the slow rise of her breathing. Fresh, young, shapely, even in the crude cotton gown they had given her, even beneath the blue-white pallor of her skin, soon to become gray as a cloudy sky in a wintry twilight. Her lips moved slightly, and he backed a step away. They paused, parted moistly, showing thin white teeth. Her delicately carved face was thrown back slightly on the pillow. There was a sudden tightening of her jaw. A weirdly pitched voice floated unexpectedly from down the hall, echoing the semi-singing of Gregorian chant. Asperges me, Domine, hysopo et mundabar. The priest was beginning Mass. As the sound came, the girl's hands clenched into rigid fists beneath the sheet. Her eyes flared open to stare wildly at the ceiling. Clutching the bedclothes, she pressed the fists up against her face and cried out, "No, no, God, I won't." Paul backed out of sight and pressed himself against the wall. A knot of desolation tightened in his stomach. He looked around nervously. A nun, hearing the outcry, came scurrying down the hall, murmuring anxiously to herself. A plump mother hen in a dozen yards of starched white cloth. She gave him a quick, challenging glance and waddled inside. "Child, my child, what's wrong? Nightmares again." He heard Willie breathe a nervous moan of relief, then her voice weakly. They made me touch. Oh, God, I want to cut off my hands." Paul fled, leaving the nun's sympathetic reassurance to fade into a murmur behind him. He spent the rest of the day and the night in his room. On the following day, Mendelhaus came with word that the boat was not yet ready. They needed to finish caulking and stock it with provisions, but the priest assured him that it should be afloat within 24 hours. Paul could not bring himself to ask about the girl. A monk brought his food, unopened cans still steaming from the sterilizer on a covered tray. The monk wore gloves and a mask, and he had oiled his own skin. There were moments when Paul felt as if he were the diseased and contagious patient from whom the others protected themselves. Like Omar, he thought, wondering, which is the potter, pray, and which the pot? Was man, as Sievers implied, a terrorized ape tribe fleeing illogically from the gray hands that only wanted to offer a blessing? How narrow was the line dividing blessing from curse, God from demon? The parasites came in a devil's mask, the mask of disease. Diseases have often killed me, said man. All disease is therefore evil. But was that necessarily true? Fire had often killed man's club-bearing ancestors, but later came to serve him. Even diseases had been used to good advantage, artificially induced typhoid and malaria to fight venereal infections. But the gray skin, taste buds in the fingertips, alien micro-organisms tampering with the nerves and the brain, such concepts caused his scalp to bristle. Man, made over to suit the tastes of a bunch of supposedly beneficent parasites. Was he still man or something else? Little bacteriological farmers embedded in the skin, raising a crop of nerve cells. Eat one, plant two, sow an olfactor in a new field, reshuffle the feeder fibers to the brain. Monday brought a cold rain and stiff wind from the Gulf. He watched the water swirling through littered gutters in the street. Sitting in the window, he watched the gloom and waited, praying that the storm would not delay his departure. Mendelhaus smiled politely through his doorway once. "Willie's ankle seems healing nicely," he said. "Swelling's gone down so much we had to change casts. If only she would—" "Thanks for the free report, Padre," Paul growled irritably. The priest shrugged and went away. It was still raining when the sky darkened with evening. The monastic dock crew had certainly been unable to finish. Tomorrow, perhaps. After nightfall, he lit a candle and lay awake watching its unflickering yellow tongue until drowsiness lulled his head aside. He snuffed it out and went to bed. Dreams assailed him, tormented him, stroked him with dark hands while he lay back, submitting freely. Small hands, soft, cool, tender, touching his forehead and his cheeks while a voice whispered caresses. He awoke suddenly to blackness. The feel of the dream hands was still on his face. What had aroused him? A sound in the hall, a creaking hinge. The darkness was impenetrable. The rain had stopped. Perhaps its cessation had disturbed him. He felt curiously tense as he lay listening to the humid, musty corridors. A faint rustle and breathing. The sound of soft breathing was in the room with him. He let out a hoarse shriek that shattered the unearthly silence. A high-pitched scream of fright answered him from a few feet away in the room. He groped toward it and fumbled against a bare wall. He roared curses and tried to find first matches, then the shotgun. At last he found the gun, aimed at nothing across the room, and jerked the trigger. The explosion deafened him. The window shattered, and a sift of plaster rustled to the floor. The brief flash had illuminated the room. It was empty. He stood, frozen. Had he imagined it all? But no. The visitor's startled scream had been real enough. A cool draft fanned his face. The door was open. Had he forgotten to lock it again? A tumult of sound was beginning to arise from the lower floors. His shot had aroused the sleepers. But there was a closer sound, sobbing in the corridor and an irregular creaking noise. At last he found a match and rushed to the door. But the tiny flame revealed nothing within its limited aura. He heard a doorknob rattle in the distance. His visitor was escaping via the outside stairway. He thought of pursuit and vengeance, but instead he rushed to the wash basin and began scrubbing himself thoroughly with harsh brown soap. Had his visitor touched him, or had the hands been only dream stuff? He was frightened and sickened. Voices were filling the corridor. The light of several candles was advancing toward his doorway. He turned to see monks' faces peering anxiously inside. Father Mendelhaus shouldered his way through the others, glanced at the window, the wall, then at Paul. "What? Safety, eh?" Paul hissed. "Well, I had a prowler, a woman. I think I've been touched." The priest turned and spoke to a monk. "Go to the stairway and call for the Mother Superior. Ask her to make an immediate inspection of the sisters' quarters. If any nuns have been out of their rooms—" A shrill voice called from down the hallway. "Father, Father! The girl with the injured ankle. She's not in her bed. She's gone." "Willie," Paul gasped. A small nun with a candle scurried up and panted to recover her breath for a moment. "She's gone. Father, I was on night duty. I heard the shot, and I went to see if it disturbed her. She wasn't there." The priest grumbled incredulously. "How could she get out? She can't walk with that cast." "Crutches, Father. We told her she could get up in a few days. While she was still irrational, she kept saying they were going to amputate her leg. We brought the crutches in to prove she'd be up soon. It's my fault, Father. I should have—" "Never mind. Search the building for her." Paul dried his wet skin and faced the priest angrily. "What can I do to disinfect myself?" he demanded. Mendelhaus called into the hallway where a crowd had gathered. "Someone please get Dr. Sievers." "I'm here, preacher," grunted the scientist. The monastics parted ranks to make way for his short, chubby body. He grinned amusedly at Paul. "So, you decided to make your home here after all, eh?" Paul croaked an insult at him. "Have you got any effective—" "Disinfectants? Afraid not. Nitric acid will do the trick on 1 or 2 local spots. Where were you touched?" "I don't know. I was asleep." Sievers' grin widened. "Well, you can't take a bath in nitric acid. We'll try something else, but I doubt if it'll work for a direct touch." "That oil?" That'll do for exposure-weakened parasites you might pick up by handling an object that's been touched. But with skin-to-skin contact, the bugs are pretty stout little rascals. Come on downstairs, though. We'll make a pass at it." Paul followed him quickly down the corridor. Behind him, a soft voice was murmuring, "I just can't understand why non-hypers are so—" Mendelhaus said something to Sievers, blotting out the voice. Paul chafed at the thought that they might consider him cowardly. But with the herds fleeing northward, cowardice was the social norm, and after a year's flight, Paul had accepted the norm as the only possible way to fight. Sievers was emptying chemicals into a tub of water in the basement when a monk hurried in to tug at Mendelhaus's sleeve. "Father, the sisters report that the girl's not in the building." "What?" "Well, she can't be far. Search the grounds. If she's not there, try the adjoining blocks." Paul stopped unbuttoning his shirt. Willie had said some mournful things about what she would rather do than submit to the craving, and her startled scream when he had cried out in the darkness, the scream of someone suddenly awakening to reality from a day's world. The monk left the room. Sievers sloshed more chemicals into the tub. Paul could hear the wind whipping about the basement windows and the growl of an angry surf not so far away. Paul rebuttoned his shirt. "Which way's the ocean?" he asked suddenly. He backed toward the door. "No, you fool!" roared Sievers. "You're not going to— Get him, preacher!" Paul sidestepped as the priest grabbed for him. He darted outside and began running for the stairs. Mendelhaus bellowed for him to stop. "Not me!" Paul called back angrily. "Willie!" Moments later, he was racing across the sodden lawn and into the street. He stopped on the corner to get his bearings. The wind brought the sound of the surf with it. He began running east and calling her name into the night. The rain had ceased, but the pavement was wet and water gurgled in the gutters. Occasionally, the moon peered through the thinning veil of clouds, but its light failed to furnish a view of the street ahead. After a minute's running, he found himself standing on the seawall. The breakers thundered a stone's throw across the sand. For a moment, they became visible under the coy moon, then vanished again in blackness. He had not seen her. "Willie!" Only the breaker's growl responded, and a glimmer of phosphorescence from the waves. "Willie!" He slipped down from the seawall and began feeling along the jagged rocks that lay beneath it. She could not have gotten down without falling. Then he remembered a rickety flight of steps just to the north, and he trotted quickly toward it. The moon came out suddenly. He saw her and stopped. She was sitting motionless on the bottom step, holding her face in her hands. The crutches were stacked neatly against the handrail. 10 yards across the sand slope lay the hungry, devouring surf. Paul approached her slowly. The moon went out again. His feet sucked at the rain-soaked sand. He stopped by the handrail, peering at her motionless shadow. "Willie?" A low moan, then a long silence. "I did it, Paul," she muttered miserably. "It was like a dream at first, but then you shouted, and—" He crouched in front of her, sitting on his heels. Then he took her wrists firmly and tugged her hands from her face. "Don't!" He pulled her close and kissed her. Her mouth was frightened. Then he lifted her, being cautious of the now sodden cast. He climbed the steps and started back to the hospital. Willie, dazed and weary and still uncomprehending, fell asleep in his arms. Her hair blew about his face in the wind. It smelled warm and alive. He wondered what sensation it would produce to the finger-pore receptors. "Wait and see," he said to himself. The priest met him with a growing grin when he brought her into the candlelit corridor. "Shall we forget the boat, son?" Paul paused. "No. I'd like to borrow it anyway." Mendelhaus looked puzzled. Sievers snorted at him. "Preacher, don't you know any reasons for traveling besides running away?" Paul carried her back to her room. He meant to have a long talk when she awoke. About an island. Until the world sobered up.